네, 2부를 시작하겠습니다.
So now we're going to start part 2 for today.
감사하겠습니다.
I'd like to ask our participants to come inside and take your seats.
안녕하세요. 전 세계에 계신 기본소득 지지자 여러분.
Good afternoon. It's great to meet you all.
맡은 이지은이라고 합니다.
This session will discuss basic income in the era of multiple crises. My name is Ji-Eun, your moderator today, and a member of the BIKN.
기본소득에 대해서
Let me briefly talk about my personal story about basic income. I took interest in basic income in earnest because I believe that basic income will be an important step towards establishing a universal welfare state. As a student of social policy, I believe that basic income is an essential element in order to remove the paternalism of welfare states, strengthen universal rights, and achieving gender justice because of its critical aspect of individuality. However, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I have been rethinking my perspective on basic income. I ask questions like, is this system sustainable
측면에서 주장을 할 것인지, 혹은
when we are hit by unexpected climate crisis?
혹은 이 모두의 맥락.
What does basic income mean?
너무 슬프게도 지금 시적절한 주제가 되었습니다.
Now, all these questions have become more relevant than ever. We are living in the era of extinction, which cannot be adequately described as a climate crisis. Inequality is worsening and uncertainty is increasing. In this era of multiple crises, we need to have a more clear understanding of the crises and the relevance of basic income.
현재의 시대적 의미를
I believe that this session will be an opportunity to share our ideas on these issues. So we have invited three speakers who have been conducting research actively in this domain. Let me explain how we're going to proceed. We are going to wrap up the session 15 minutes earlier than what's written on the program because you need to move to different parallel sessions. So it's going to be over at 2:45 Korean time. We'll listen to all three presentations first and then move on to Q&A. And we will spend
보고 계신 분들은 지금
adequate time for discussion with the audience who are here in person and joining us online. Please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to be passed before asking any questions. Let me now introduce the first speaker, Dr. Pinto. Dr. Pinto has a diverse backgrounds. First of all, he is a research associate at the Center for Ethics, Politics and Society at the University of Minho, Portugal, because he believed that ecological vision is the only tool to guarantee fair global development. He majored in environmental engineering for his master's degree. Also, with interest in political environmentalism and alternative models of globalization, he conducted research on universal basic income, sustainable consumption, and ecological citizenship for his doctor's degree. He's also a co-founder of the Portuguese party called Liber. He is going to run for an election for the European Parliament. Now, let me invite Dr. Pinto for his presentation.
안녕하세요. Hello. I must thank everyone that made this Congress possible before everything else, your Chung-Ang, but everyone at the local organizing committee. I think you are raising the bar for future Congresses, so thank you for everything. I was invited to we can applaud later, all of them. I was invited to speak about basic income in an era of multiple crises. So this is a huge topic, as you can imagine. I've tried to address a number of different topics, so my presentation will very lightly touch a number of them, not in full detail as it should be, but in 15 minutes, I'll do my best. And I start with the idea of fragility and finitude, right? So human life, independently of religions or conceptions of life after death, as an end, as at least as we know it. Our body ceases to exist, we decay, it disappears. And this means that among other aspects, but at least on this specific aspect, we are vulnerable. And our vulnerability implies fragility. And because of that, I think that we are all socially vulnerable and fragile. We share this common vulnerability and fragility, although in different degrees, as we shall see later. This links actually very much with the idea of fraternity that was yesterday discussed by Philippe van Parijs. Sorry, the other way. Similarly, I think the planet is finite as well, and it is so in a multiple number of ways. First, because it will disappear at some point in the very long term, right? Our sun will implode and then explode, taking the Earth with it. But it is as well finite in a much more touchable or relatable sense. It is finite in terms of what we call natural resources, right? They are finite in our planet, and as well finite in terms of what the planet itself can do to deal and clean in terms of pollution, emissions, fish stocks that were discussed yesterday as well. So because of that, I think that similarly to what is the case with human life, I think there's a need to acknowledge shared ecological vulnerability and again, fragility. The two come together in this era of multiple crises, which is the topic of our session today. And what are those multiple crises? Well, I've highlighted 4 there that they are interlinked. There are many more, and within each one of them there are multiple crises, of course. But when we talk about ecological crisis, social crisis, economical crisis, inflation, inequalities, all that, in ecological we can think of the Fukushima water that will be released now, or the fires that are going on in Europe, a bit all over Europe, the maximum temperatures, you name it. And then as well, health crisis, because COVID outbreak, Ebola, all of those have been proven to at least have some link to the fact that we are destroying the forests. And because of that, wild animals are getting closer to the humans. And because of that, we are sharing more viruses that lead to these possible outbreaks. So I think that we need to acknowledge and accept that fragility that is shared and respect, accepting it, respect both the maximum that the planet can take in terms of planet boundaries, I think is a good indicator, and in parallel to respond to the social and economic aspects, the social baseline. I think Kate Raworth, with her donut economics theory, has explained it in a very easy way to visualize, and to understand. So before going forward, I have 2 slides that I will go rather quickly because they are not the main point of the presentation, but I think it is important to discuss at least 4 escape strategies that refuse this idea of fragility and vulnerability, right? So the first one is escape by the elites. And what do I mean by this is that elites might acknowledge that there is this fragility, that there is this vulnerability, but despite that, they don't want to address it directly, but rather to protect themselves, right? And they do it in a number of ways, constructing bunkers, really creating their own spaces, not frequenting anymore the public space. And I think there's a movie, and sorry, I'm not capable of recommending it like Jürgen has done yesterday for the Western Spaghetti, because the movie is not good on itself. But this movie, Elysium, I think is a perfect example of this possible escape strategy. To tell you, is a movie where Earth still exists, but is almost impossible to live. There's very limited amount of resources, but most of the population lives here and fights for death to have access to those resources, whereas a very small minority lives in a satellite called Elysium with all the best, so it's green fields, a lot of food, a lot of water. So this is a possible strategy. A second strategy, very quickly now, is an internal escape. So you don't really try to understand what's happening on the outside, you focus on the inside, you know, all these mindfulness books that are quite popular a bit all over the world, for me, are a part of this escape strategy that, again, is not bad on itself, but will not serve to address this shared vulnerability. And the two others are the escape by excuse, that is simply, and I give an example there, people saying, myself as an individual, I will not have an impact, so why should I care? And the end result might even be a sort of double down in our own actions that despite we know that they are not good for the planet, we say the planet will nevertheless end, so I must as well just travel as much as I can, take the plane as much as I can. And the final point, which is quite provocative, or a bit provocative at least, that is for this more radical or almost anti-humanist view of ecology that says that what is happening to the planet, be it COVID, be it, you know, extreme climate change, is due to human action, and because it's due to human action, we are only paying the fair price due to our own actions. I completely disagree with this point. And in a way, it relates to this famous discussion already in the 80s between social ecology and deep ecology scholars. So what I think we should do, avoiding those escape strategies, I think we really need to prepare a future that is anchored in three main aspects, which are human or humankind, nature and non-human animals, and technology. And what do I mean by this? I think that since the Enlightenment, and already a caveat, don't take me for the anti-modernist or post-modernist, because I am not, but the Enlightenment brought a view of man almost as an all-powerful creature that could do everything he wanted, as long as science, that was thought to become unstoppable, could do it, right? There's this very famous quote from René Descartes when he says that man is the master and owner of the land. So this sentence is quite problematic because it could be understood that for human emancipation, which is a good on itself, we might do it or we might achieve it at the expenses of the planet. Well, as I've said in the very beginning of the presentation, the planet is finite, so this idea is by definition impossible to maintain in the medium or longer term. And actually in the present, if we look again to these planetary boundaries, it's already impossible to accept this idea in the present. So we need a sort of new deal, I call it a new social and ecological deal, that does a number of things. First, does not reject technology, because again, there are some views that are putting technology in a very problematic place and they exclude technology from possible solutions. I don't think that should be the case, but we need to create emancipatory and non-dominating technologies, right? So this goes back to convivial tools, for example, to adequate tools, Schumacher's proposition, for example, and technology that is understood and controlled by the people and is developed and created for the people themselves, right? And this technology must allow two things. First, human emancipation, shared human emancipation, but at the same time, the preservation of the planet and the planet's resources. At the same time, I think it is essential to recognize the intrinsic value of nature. And I know this might be problematic, probably not at this Congress, but in a lot of places, this sentence might be problematic. But the intrinsic value of nature and the role of humans as part of the nature. So I'm very fond of this conception that Murray Bookchin has of first and second nature. I think they fit very well, but we leave that for a future talk. Going now to the basic income, what then can a basic income do to become part of this or to support this new social and ecological deal? So there's a number of things that I will need to go, unfortunately, rather quickly because it's a lot of them and I will not have the opportunity to go in detail. But first, looking at the social and economic crisis, I think basic income, and we discussed it already at this Congress, has a key role reducing or can have a key role reducing wealth inequalities, be it in this intergenerational sense. And there's a t-shirt for sale outside, I saw that says, basic income is my inheritance. I think it's actually a quite nice way to put it. But again, this is in competition with other possible inheritance funds. Even recently, a couple of months or last month in the Spanish national elections, the left-wing party Sumar had a proposition to give 20,000 euros to each citizen turning 18 and that money would be fully financed by a tax on the wealthiest part of the population. So it was explicitly a sort of inheritance tax, but it can be translated not into a grant or a single payment, but rather into a basic income. Likewise, as Piketty and Chancel have shown, there's a very strong and clear link between income, wealth, and carbon footprint, right? So by opposing the wealth inequalities and financing with that a basic income, there's possibility, and I say again, it's a possibility, nothing of this is empirical or hard science, but there's a clear possibility to reduce as well the global carbon footprint. Which takes me to the next point, which is my favorite point, or the point I've done more research about, reducing the ecological impact of basic income. And this is done in a multiple number of ways. First is, and I will go very quickly because the next slide I discuss a bit more, allowing different ways of work, right? So really breaking the conceptions or separating the conceptions of labor and work, putting the focus on work where in principle and in its vast majority, the carbon impact is lower than in high intensive labor activities. And a final point that is very present right now in Europe is the possible, and it was already discussed, and I'm sure it will be discussed, for example, in the farmers' income panel, the possible financial support to get political support to measures that aim at ecological protection. So recently, very recently, a couple of weeks ago, in the European Parliament, there was a vote, a critical vote of a flagship initiative of the European Green Deal, which is the nature restoration law that finally was approved after a lot of changes, but was approved, and this was not even certain, because the right wing were opposing it, saying, you know, it will be unfair for the people, to be unfair for the farmers. So maybe a basic income can have can contribute to grab or to gather more support for this kind of essential nature laws. Regarding labor, so two clear points there. What can be the impact? Well, is it more labor intensive, more resource intensive? Of course, we need to get away from nature resource intensity. But there was a very interesting paper that I quote there in 2020, so 3 years ago, that distinguished two scenarios. One was a local self-sufficiency scenario that the authors link with degrowth. I have some doubts there, but anyways, I'm quoting the authors there. And the second scenario is basic income in an automation, capital-intensive, high-technology economy. And they proved, or they argue that the second scenario is the one where basic income has better chances to be implemented. But again, it takes us to the question I posed earlier: whose technology, who controls that technology, and on whose interest, right? Because if it is a high-tech economy controlled by 3 or 4 high-tech companies, I'm not sure that this will serve to emancipate human beings. So another question yet related to labor or to work, and I think it's quite important here in South Korea, because I was looking into the figures before coming. There's an average working hours of almost 2,000 working hours, which compares to 1,400 in France. And I discovered, and I think this is a very bad sign, that you even have a word in Korean for death due to excess of work, which is kwarosa. So I think this great resignation that has been called post-COVID, is it going to be observed or not? And if so, is it going to be observed all over the world, especially in places, and we heard it yesterday in one of the welcoming speeches, where there's a cultural or religious traditions like the Confucian year that gives a lot of cultural and social importance to labor, to work, right? So what can be done? Can a basic income contribute to that cultural change or not? I have 15 seconds and 2 slides, but I will be very quick now. I think basic income can as well contribute to social innovation, and here there's a number of things that can be considered. So the autonomous sphere, that defined by André Gorz as the sphere of activities. I don't know how to stop this. Sorry. Oops. I think it is. Yeah. Sorry. 1 minute, Ji-Eun, sorry, please for that. So the autonomous sphere, which is basically where we develop the activities we want ourselves to develop, and this goes against, or yes, against, I think is the word, heteronomous sphere. But I think there's even a more important aspect here regarding basic income, is that basic income does really give us the possibility to be who we want to be, but even more important, it gives us the possibility to be what we can be, you know? So there's a lot of potential that is not expressed simply because a lot of us don't have the means, the economic means, to even get to our full potential, you know, and this starts at a very early age when you are excluded from education. I was talking with some Korean friends. They told me that you have 4, 5, 6 private tutors at a very young age, and if you don't have so, when you are 6 years old, you are already pretty much excluded from future opportunities. So basic income can have a role here. Political innovation, so there's a number of things there that you see on the slide as well. And I think this political innovation, I'm very fond of the idea that Philippe expressed yesterday from Alain Caillet and Caterina. So this idea don contre don, so gift and the gift back, that is actually going back to the anthropological studies of Marcel Mauss. And I really believe in this idea of the gift, and I think that an expression of the counter gift, so the gift of the citizens after receiving the basic income, is more active political participation. Technical innovation, so the technology, open source, cosmolocalism, so is a concept that was brought forward in the beginning of the 90s, that basically is an international of do-it-yourself, where the software code is developed in a number of different places, open source, and then you build the stuff according to local needs. This has expression mostly in farming tools, but it has as well a big expression in things such as a satellite. There's a satellite in our orbit already that was developed like this. Bionic hand that was developed like this, sharing code and sharing resources. So I do believe that basic income, by giving us more disposable time, will have a contribution as well to technical innovation, but technical innovation that is serving the people and emancipating the people. Finally, very quickly, it can serve to build a new imaginary in a number of different ways that is not only EU and US centered. I think we should look to concepts like pluriverse. I think it is essential to have these kind of congresses in places like South Korea to have different views. And I end with a very final bullet point. Basic income can contribute to put an end to the dualism between humanity and nature, and serve to do something that the 19th century geographer and anarchist Élisée Reclus said, which is making us realize that humans are nature simply gaining conscience of itself. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다, 핀투 박사님.
Thank you very much, Professor Pinto. In the time of crisis, especially when it comes to the ecological crisis, we looked at how they are interlinked and how a BI can play a role throughout the process. The next presenter is the director, Geum of the Institute for Political and Economic Alternatives. He contributed to the foundation of the Basic Income Korean Network, and he's been serving as a director. He's been studying law and philosophy for a long time, and when it comes to digital capitalism, energy transition, basic income, and commonwealth funds, he's been doing lots of researches in these fields. And also, he published a book titled Everyone's Share for Everyone in 2020. And the most recent one is he's leading a research, and he looked at the role of AI in terms of BI. And please welcome Director Geum, who is leading advocate in this field.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in Korean. So this is the era of artificial intelligence. Looks like the social discussion on AI is mostly about its ethics, but not its political economy.
사람들은
Now, AI is being developed by businesses, high-tech businesses. And why are they doing that?
이윤을 극대화.
It is to maximize capital profits.
중요한 문제는
And what is critical here is how is it maximized?
인공지능이 새로운 물질을
Now, AI does not lead to invention of new material or a new way of manufacturing.
그러나
It has not advanced to that level. However, the use of AI does have a lot of impact on the economy of time.
인공지능이 도입된 이후로 더
So,
빨리
with the introduction of AI, the economy works much faster every single day.
이 데이터 기반 인공지능
And data-based AI
주의 경제를 가속화시키는 거라고 말을
accelerates the capitalist economy.
첫 번째 생산 가동 시간을 줄여서
Data-based AI shortens the production time.
알 수 있듯이
And as we can learn from the ad platform, circulation period gets shorter and reinvestment period also gets shorter.
네, 그러면 인공지능, 현 단계의 인공지능은 사실은 일종의
So AI today is a form of time technology.
이 시간 기술을 장악한 자본은
And capital that
재생산까지
dominates the time technology
되고 그리고
will dominate the entire society.
사회 인프라 전체에 대한 자본의 장악은 훨씬 더 심해요.
Not just production. And
인공지능이
the level
과연
of
어디에 기초해 있는가? 인공지능이 이윤을 만들어내는데
control
이 이윤
of the society by capital will only get deeper. Now, what is the source of
이 추출
the development AI?
액티비즘에 기초해 있다.
I believe that it is based on two types of extractivism. First of all, extraction of data.
환경 생태적인 측면에서
And from an ecological perspective, you cannot ignore raw materials. You need to extract lithium.
전기를 써야죠.
And actually, we can also talk about the third thing. You need to extract electricity, a huge amount of electricity.
봐야 될 건가?
So, how should we look at data in this context?
노동이 아닙니다.
Now, data is not labor. It's digital records of human activity.
추출하고
Now, that is being extracted, processed, and stored by capital. And based on data, they develop AI.
데이터 추출이라고
So, extraction of data is at the center of AI today.
이 사회적 관계는 플랫폼이고
And the social relations that allows that is platform. That is why platform capitalism is a newly coined term to describe the era of AI. And what is almost as important is computing power.
1년 동안 이 LLM, 라지 랭귀지 모델
In the past year, the emergence of large language model, or the LLM,
사회적인 논쟁
became a milestone in the development of AI, and many social debates heated up.
거대 언어 모델 LLM이 아직 산업에 활용되고
Now, the use of LLM in industrial process is still in its infancy.
특수한
However,
이 모델은 이미 산업에
among the language models, domain specific architecture, or the DSA, is being used in industries.
하는 빅테크들은 일종의
Now, the big techs developing LLM will play the role of a crowd platform,
기반으로 해서
and
LLM 클라우드 플랫폼
all algorithms will be developed with the connection of LLM.
오픈 AI라든지
You need to access LLM in order to develop new algorithms.
사회적 인프라 전체를 통째로 장악하고
That means big tech platforms will dominate the infrastructure of AI development and in turn the infrastructure of the society. In the past, CPUs were used for development.
이제는
Yeah, at that time, developers had more or less equal infrastructure. But today, they are using GPU, which requires a lot of capital investment. It's a highly capital-intensive sector. So today, the development of AI today is almost monopolized by big techs who are dominating computing power.
팔자가 깨지고 그래서
Now it
죄송합니다.
looks like some characters are broken on the slides. I'm sorry for that. So what are the effects of AI? Of course, there are positive and negative effects.
이 시간을 단축할 수
First
있습니다.
of all, we can do things faster,
더
which means
자유로운 활동에 더 많은 시간을
humans
쓸 수 있다.
become freer
생산 시간,
to pursue
시간, 재투자 시간 등등이 단축되면서
other things.
사람들은 더 많은 여유를 얻을 수도 있습니다.
We can enjoy more time for leisure or engage in liberating activities.
시간을 단축한다는
However, saving time means saving labor hours,
일자리가
which can lead to reduced jobs.
완전 자동화된 사회 이전이라 하더라도
Even before a fully automated society,
그리고
labor hours will be shortened
이 저임금화되는 현상들이 나타나죠.
and labor will be paid lower and lower.
감시자본주의.
And the second potential problem is surveillance capitalism, as described by Zuboff.
문제.
And also, there's the ecological problem. They still rely on fossil fuels.
할수록 반생태적인 효과가 나오겠죠.
In this context, greater use of AI means
이게
more devastation.
네. 인공지능에 기반한 자본주의가 어떤 사회적 갈등을 회피하려면은
Now, AI-based capitalism
해결해야 됩니다. 하나는 분배 문제,
should avoid social conflict
감시의 문제입니다.
by solving two problems. First, distribution. Second, the problem of surveillance.
같은 게 아니라 좀 다른
In order to solve surveillance,
통과시
you need other solutions
등등
than basic income. For example, GDPR passed by the EU recently.
분배 문제를
Here, basic income is a powerful
수단이
tool to solving the problem of distribution.
저임금화 현상이 보편화됐고
Already,
생산성의 향상,
employment
소득
is increasingly becoming low paid, and productivity growth and income growth are
그런 시대.
being decoupled,
그리고 만약 이
as someone describes it as the great decoupling.
이런 그레이트 디카플링에 대해서 우리가 보완책을
With the introduction of basic income,
있는 완전 자동화된 사회에 대한 준비도
the problems of great decoupling can be resolved to some extent, and we'll be able to prepare for a fully automated society in the future.
인공지능의 정치 경제학이 거꾸로 기본소득에 대한 정당화 논거를 제공해 준다는 얘기입니다.
But today, I'd like to look at this issue from a reverse angle, because the political economy of AI can actually provide rationale for basic income. Like I said earlier, AI is based on data, and language models are based on training data, and platform capitals
매일매일 고객 데이터를 모아야 됩니다.
have to keep collecting customer data every day. They cannot work if there is no data.
오늘날 신문에 많이 나오는
Now, there are many news articles about LLM
저작권 문제죠.
and about the issue of copyright of training data.
더 중요한 문제는
But there is another, actually more important issue,
민감하지 않은 훈련 데이터로도 충분히
which is LLM can be
있다는 얘기입니다.
developed and trained enough with non-IP sensitive data.
이 사회 전체의
And the non-IP sensitive data actually belongs to all members of the society.
할 수 있다는 겁니다. 그렇다 그러면은 인공지능의 활용을 통해서 생긴 이윤의
then
일부분은 적어도 사회구성 모두에게
at least a portion of the profits generated by using AI can be and should be distributed as basic income to all members of society.
인공지능 자본주의의 가장 핵심적인 특징은 데이터 중심성입니다.
Now, the centrality of data is a crucial characteristic of AI capitalism.
대당으로서의
So we can coin new terms such as data dividend as a form of basic income financed by the use of AI.
그냥
Then
아무것도 의존하지 않고 개발을 하느냐 그건 아니죠.
what about the developers or the development process of AI itself? Do they work
의미에서
by themselves? They actually rely on the common knowledge of all humans.
인공지능의 수익을 기본소득 재원
This is another a source of justification of AI financed basic income.
하더라도 거의 모든 기술 기업의 이 인공지능 개발에 쓰이는
In fact, many of the technologies used to develop AI were created with public investment by US federal government in the past. Now, the US government hasn't received any return from that investment.
우리가 요구할 수 있고
Therefore, we can demand a reward for the investment made by taxpayer money, and
사용해야 된다라고 생각합니다.
as a form of that, a portion of the profits from the use of AI should be returned to society. That's it. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 인공지능이 시간의 가속성에
Thank you very much. There was a great presentation that describes how AI is accelerating the capitalist economy, and also about a proposal about an AI-financed basic income. The next speaker is Professor Almaz Zelleke, who will talk about basic income and care crisis.
정치학과에서 정치 이론과
She is professor of practice in political science at NYU Shanghai, where she teaches political theory, feminist social theory, and comparative political economy. Her articles are on basic income, distributive justice, welfare policy, and feminist political theory.
드리고자 합니다.
Professor Zelleke, the floor is yours.
드리겠습니다.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here for another wonderful basic income conference in Seoul and to be able to speak at this historic women's university. I was asked to speak on the relation between basic income and the crisis of care. It's difficult to know how or where to begin to describe the crisis of care because there are so many different crises of care in different parts of the world today. But I want to take issue for the moment with the idea that we are now in a particularly acute moment of crisis around care. Care has been in crisis since at least the advent of industrial capitalism. This is not to say that there were no crises of care prior to industrial capitalism, but to highlight a form of crisis particular to the capitalist age we still inhabit. The disjunction between the accumulative, exploitative, and alienating ethos of capitalism and the unprofitable, reciprocal, and relational ethos of care. Care is typically recognized as a crisis when care services become unavailable, or at least unavailable at the preferred low-cost or no-cost basis patriarchal capitalism leads us to expect. So here's an example of crisis of care from the US senator responsible for the defeat of the Family Assistance Plan, a proposed guaranteed minimum income plan in 1971. We couldn't have a guaranteed income in the United States because Senator Long couldn't find any women to iron his shirts. You can see other crises now in shortages of care workers in many countries, in the global trade that diverts caregivers from the global south to the global north, and in the plummeting fertility rates in almost all advanced capitalist economies. So these are the rates of children per woman in OECD countries. They're all below replacement level of 2.1 children, except for one country, which is an outlier at the top, and that's Israel. And there's another outlier at the very bottom where replacement rate is below 1 child per person. Does anybody know what country that is? Yes. But that low market price for care in the capitalist context has always been a crisis for caregivers and care recipients. This manifests in the pervasive and persistent economic, political, and social inequality of those responsible for care, who are primarily women. This is the European Institute for Gender Equality's index, showing how far even Europe is from gender equality, which would be represented by a score of 100. The crises of care are the result of market fundamentalism of contemporary capitalism, which crowds out social relations that are not profitable to workers and to owners of capital. A basic income on its own, of course, cannot remedy all the problems of contemporary capitalism, but at its foundation, basic income recognizes and enables unprofitable forms of human relations. And at its best, it guarantees that all members of society, even the unprofitable ones, the means necessary for a decent or even a good life. As a result, the principles in the idea, embodied in the idea of a basic income, are useful tools for analyzing the ways our societies currently support or fail to support the inescapable precarity and mutual dependence of human existence. Because the work of care in patriarchal capitalism is organized and reinforced by the inequality of the genders, the question I want to address today is how the idea of a basic income can help move us toward a more gender egalitarian society. I take my prompt from the theme of this conference, Basic Income and Reality, to imagine a shift to a feasible, rather than a utopian form of gender equality. And I take inspiration from Hyo-Sang-An's image in his welcoming remarks that basic income is no longer an enemy at the gate, but a horse in the castle in many countries. To put it another way, basic income has established itself as a popular meme in many countries, firmly in the public consciousness, if not yet as firmly on the political agenda. So here are a couple of memes about basic income from both sides of the political spectrum in the US, with Andrew Yang on the left and some former Republican presidents on the right laughing about the idea. So again, I want to consider how we can use the awareness, that general awareness of basic income, to move forward the fundamental principle of a basic income, that everybody, regardless of gender or care needs or responsibilities, should have the means necessary for a decent or even a good life in institutions and social policies in our home countries as they currently exist. I see the three key features of basic income, unconditionality, universality, and individuality, as analytical tools that can be applied to existing social policy programs to advance us toward that principle. I see this approach in both pragmatic and idealistic terms. In all countries, basic income will have to coexist with or adapt existing income support programs. My goal is to both advance incrementally towards a basic income by reforming existing income support programs in its image, and also to prepare the necessary institutional framework for the eventual adoption of a basic income. Providing economic security for all is, in many countries, the unfinished business of the long 20th century. The development of social policy states in the world's advanced economies was an acknowledgement of the truth about all our capitalist economies, that economic security can only result from a combination of earned income and income support organized collectively. The gendered development of these social policy states reflects an additional under-acknowledged truth about our economies, that productive work and paid employment depends on a foundation of unpaid reproductive care work. The context in which much of this social policy development took place embedded a gender bias in favor of typically male life and employment patterns, traditional family structures, and a gendered division of labor between a productive breadwinner and a non-productive dependent caregiver. This is because of the particular relationship of women's labor to economic development. Prior to industrial development, women, men, and children worked side by side in agricultural and informal labor markets. As economic activity shifts to cities and factories, home and work separate, requiring a caregiving presence in the household and leading to a gender division of labor. The The women who do go out to work are likely to be daughters, leaving mothers at home alone with what used to be a shared responsibility. This creates what the economist Claudia Golden has identified as a U-shaped pattern in the labor participation, the paid labor participation of married women in particular, here using middle age as a proxy for marital and maternal status. As the economy and social state develop, indicated by increasing GDP along the x-axis, opportunity for women's employment increase. Importantly, though, the stage of industrial development when women's paid labor participation is at its lowest point, right at the bottom of the U, is when social policy state development typically takes place. This leads to the development of the dependency model for social benefits, with benefits for caregivers contingent on their relationship to breadwinners. Today, a majority of women, mothers included, work in paid employment in most advanced economies, but women still bear a disproportionate responsibility for unpaid care, leading to lower hours in paid employment, less continuous employment, and a persistent wage gap despite women's higher educational achievement in comparison to men in many countries. In many countries, the social policy state has not evolved with these changes, and rather than mitigating the disadvantages those with the responsibility for unpaid care face in the market economy, it compounds them. Basic income's three key features point the way to changes that could be made in existing income support programs that would better support our collective care responsibilities prior to the implementation of a basic income, and at the same time prepare institutionally for the implementation of a basic income when political circumstances are ripe. So I want to share the approach that I take in these tasks in my research on the possibility of a basic income in the United States. Now, I acknowledge that the US is behind many countries in social policy development. And as sociologist Jessica Calarco noted during the COVID pandemic, presumably with Europe in mind as a comparison, other countries have social safety nets, the US has women. But I hope the approach I take is applicable to other countries where many gender inequalities remain in spite of a more highly developed social policy state. For women in the US, the most transformative of basic income's three key features for existing income support programs is perhaps its individuality. The marital or household basis of our income support programs works to the detriment of women's economic security. So I want to mention 4 examples here. First, social assistance programs. Those are targeted to the poor through means testing and high withdrawal rates, and are based on household income levels, which means that they are quickly lost when 2 incomes, however low on the income ladder, are combined. This marriage penalty traps poor single parents who bear a dual responsibility for unpaid care work and earned income in poverty and isolation, preventing them from sharing those responsibilities with another adult. Shifting social assistance benefits to an individual additive basis, i.e. in the direction of a per-person basic income, would remove this disincentive even if social assistance benefits remained, for the time being, means tested. Second and third, 2 examples related to the way the tax system assesses married couples. So the US tax system, in contrast to the social assistance programs, provides a marriage bonus for middle and upper income taxpayers, especially those with a traditionally gendered division of labor between an employed breadwinner and a non-working caregiver. It does this through joint tax assessment of married couples with a preferential tax schedule for married couples compared to single taxpayers and single parent families. This marriage bonus compounds the economic inequality between our most economically vulnerable and most privileged families and reduces the tax revenue available for spending on public provision of care services. Shifting taxation to an individual basis would equalize the tax burdens of earners with the same income, reducing rather than compounding the inequalities created by the market. Joint taxation of married couples also creates a secondary earner paid labor disincentive that primarily affects women, but applies to the lower earning spouse of any gender. In progressive tax systems, joint taxation splits the income tax burden evenly between the spouses, effectively lowering progressive tax rates on the primary higher earner and raising them on the secondary lower earner. This creates an economic incentive to minimize the paid labor of the secondary worker and to maximize the paid labor of the primary earner, reinforcing uneven divisions of labor between paid work and unpaid care, leading to lifelong inequalities of income and wealth that are then compounded by the US pension systems. Empirical research confirms that shifting taxation and tax system benefits provision to an individual basis promotes a more gender egalitarian split between paid labor and at least hours available for unpaid care work, increasing women's hours in paid labor by as much as 30% in some countries, and achieving smaller but significant reductions in men's hours. The last one is also related to the tax system, but it's about the way dependents are treated. So the last US presidential administration's tax legislation in 2017 eliminated individual and additive tax exemptions for each household member in favor of a standard exemption that varies only by tax filing status, with the largest exemption for married couples, regardless of whether they have children or not. The current presidential administration tried to restore a more generous, refundable exemption for children than the small tax credit, which still remains, but was unable to extend it beyond 1 year as part of the response to the COVID pandemic. Individual exemptions for children are a critical support for the expenses of child rearing, as well as a critical part of the infrastructure for a truly universal basic income in countries like the US without an existing child allowance, where a child basic income would be critical. In these and many other cases, gender-neutral income support programs ostensibly designed to promote the economic security of US citizens instead compound and reinforce the inequalities created by the gender distribution of unpaid care and paid labor. In these cases, the principles of an unconditional, universal, and particularly an individual basic income point the way to modifications that would be more supportive of caregivers and allow workers of any gender to take on care responsibilities without facing economic insecurity. These income support examples may be particular to the US, but every country in the world has persistent inequalities of gender in economic, political, and social power. The European Union's 2023 report on gender equality finds that continuing gender gaps in employment, pay, pensions, and unpaid care, despite members' countries' higher social spending than the US. The World Economic Forum calculates a gender parity gap in Europe of 24% and projects that closing the gap will take 67 years. On its economic participation and opportunity subindex, the US actually outperforms all but 4 European countries, the usual suspects, Norway, Iceland, Sweden, and Finland, all important examples which represent a tiny proportion of Europe's population. Income support programs and other social policies, even in countries with more generous and extensive social policy states, fail to remedy market-based gender inequalities and continue to reinforce the gendered divisions of labor. Examining the idea of a basic income, I'm just about finished. I'm just finishing up now. Examining the idea of a basic income from a feminist perspective and turning that perspective to the structure of ostensibly gender-neutral income support programs are only the first steps, of course. They provide insight into how gender inequality and crises of care persist more than 100 years after women began to demand political equality, and more than 50 years after we began to demand economic equality. The next step is to uncover the political obstacles to bringing about gender-inclusive support programs, income support programs. And my hope is that all of us today will committed to the implementation of the basic income in our respective countries will find ways to move existing income support programs in the direction of a gender-inclusive basic income and thus prepare the ground for its eventual arrival. I will just end by leaving you on a hopeful note in the spirit of Kim Jong-chol with one more meme about basic income. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다, 젤레케 교수님.
Thank you very much, Professor Zelleke.
네, 현재 자본주의 체제가 어떻게 지금의 현재의 생산 노동이 생산 노동에 의존하고 있고
She explained how the productive labor is based on reproductive labor and how the gender division of labor is being consolidated. In particular,
그러한 측면에서
compared to the US social policy, she explained how basic income can be a step towards justice. let's move on to discussion and Q&A with the audience.
혹시 질문이 있으신 분들
If you have any question, please raise your hand.
말씀해 주시면 되겠습니다.
We'll start with in-person participants.
네, 가운데 계신 분 말씀해 주세요.
We have a hand in the middle.
Hello, I'm Julio Linares, part of the EC of PN. I thank you, first of all, for your very good interventions. That was very stimulating. I think I have two questions. The first question is about the political economy of AI. So there is a part that I felt was not named, which is the labor that is behind a lot of the training of the AI, of the large language modeling, which is often gender and is often racialized. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about the people who are training the algorithms, often in the global south, just for to know a bit more about that. And I think the second question is for the other two panelists. So talking about the state and capitalist states, and on the one hand, and how through taxation, sort of the distinction between productive labor, the worker, and the caregiver emerges. And on the other hand, talking about the sort of social ecology or ecological arguments to, bridge the gap that today exists between human nature and second nature, as you call it, Jorge. I wonder, with the introduction of a basic income, what do you think happens to the state? I'll just leave it there.
또 다른 질문이 있으실까요? 네.
Do we have any other questions?
Hi, my name is Geum. Thank you all for very interesting talks. Have a question about potential contribution of UBI on ecological sustainability. That your point about, because I'm losing my words, that people with disposable time and money to choose more meaningful, socially just, and ecologically sustainable activities. But I think there's a gap, significant gap between direct ecological sustainability and people's willpower to do whatever they want. So what's the direct connection between UBI and redirecting labor from moving away from the market economy to a more like a essential economy, for example, the care economy? Hope that was clear.
네, 한 질문만 더 받고
Maybe we can take one more question before we give time to our speakers to respond.
네, 저쪽 계신 분 먼저 말씀해 주세요.
예, 저는 그 기본소득당의 당원이고요. 김한샘.
I'm a member of the Basic Income Party. My name is Kim Han-sem.
저 한국에서는 이제
In Korea,
사태 때
when the pandemic
기본소득에 대한 어떤 실험
broke out,
좀 진행이 됐었는데
we did have some pilots in Korea that went on. And even though these were very well received and there was efficient distribution of capital, we did have some repercussions.
물가 상승률이라든지
For example, the inflation and how prices went up, well, there were some side effects.
브리핑
Listening to the three presentations,
이제 어떤 것이 좋은지에 대해서는
well, regarding what would be good, I basically think that we're on the same page as to what is good, but when it comes to what side effects we have and how we can mitigate or
다뤄진 바가 없는 것
handle these side effects, well, I don't think we paid full attention to this issue. So what's your take on this?
네, 세 분의 질문
Alright.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much for the three questions. Let us start with Dr. Pinto for answers.
Thank you. I'll try to maybe question number one, number two. They relate in a way. The role of the state. Well, that's a tricky one. Actually, in one of my slides, I had between brackets something saying like risk of unconditionality, thinking precisely because of that, right? Because once we expand the activities in the autonomous sphere, and I go back again to André Gorz and his proposals of creating the conditions for people to have enough time to take care of each other and, among other things, to take care of elderly people, you know, in a communitarian way or as a community. This sounds very good. I'm very fond of the idea, but this has risks, right? Because these communities, nothing tells us that they are not exclusive or that they don't exclude, you know, a number of people. That's why I do, despite all my sympathy to anarchy, if you want to put it like that, I don't think the state should disappear tout court, right? So I think the state has a role still there, and precisely this role of universality, right, is really to ensure that the community is wider than the ethnic group or wider, you know, that the language group or whatever, that the Republic, and this is actually a debate that comes often in France mostly actually, what is universality, right? Who belongs, who gets to be considered a brother or a sister under the idea of fraternité, right? So I think that's important, and I do see the state's role mostly in that sense, to still, of course, when I say, or when I think about state, is not mandatorily nation state, it can go beyond that, it could be the European Union for the matter, but I do think it needs still to exist, but nevertheless, as I said, and as you said as well, I do think there's a role when people have more disposable time and the economic means to sustain themselves to do their own, and it relates to care work as well, to do their own social and essential work on their own and not being dependent on third parties. So I hope it answers. On the other question, I think Jan was your name? Yeah. So indeed, you are right. I mean, I'm not a deterministic person. I don't think that whatever you do, there will be a written in stone outcome. So I don't think that giving people a basic income will imply that they will automatically perform non or less ecologically impacting activities. I don't. But I'm very much convinced that overall, this will be the case. And I'm convinced because what happens right now is pretty much the opposite, right? Is people in their labor sphere, so having to work to have a salary, to basically buy someone else's time in format or in the form of products and so on. And because their own time afterwards, so the time for consumption is in a way limited, they tend to even consume more. I know this sounds ironical and almost contradictory, but this is actually what is happening. People are consuming because they don't have time, you know, because I'm convinced if they have more time and again the net of the basic income, they could commit to these other less ecologically impacting activities in things as simple as, you know, small reparations, building your own stuff, sewing your own clothes, whatever. And a personal note, it gives me an incredible pleasure to do some small works at home, more than publish an academic paper. I don't know, you know, so these kinds of things. But again, I'm not deterministic. People will have different ways of using their time. And it links, and I end now to the idea or to the distinction as well between what are attitudes and behaviors, right? So what you think is right and how you can express it. So attitude, what you think, behavior, how you express it. So a lot of people have an attitude that is pro-ecology. They do think that they should consume less, or they do think that they should, have a different consumption pattern, but at the end they don't express it. So the behavior is different. And I think a basic income could serve to sort of balance this, in particular in these cases where people don't have a more pro-ecologist behavior because they don't have the time or the income. So I think there's a strong role there. And I don't know if I have the time just on side effects, but maybe I can leave for the others, and if not. Yeah.
네. 금민 소장 부탁드립니다.
Dr. Geum, please go ahead.
네, 그 데이터와 노동에 대해서 좀 말씀을
So we'll talk about data and labor.
인공지능 자본주의가 데이터 추출주의의 근거죠.
Now, AI capitalism is based on data extraction, and data extraction is based on low-paid labor. In fact, in order to label image data, you need low-paid labor. It is similar for the extraction of lithium. You need low-paid labor.
이윤이 저임금에서 나오는
So, but however, you cannot say that the profits from AI capital comes from low-paid labor.
알고리즘으로
That's too simplistic.
그 알고리즘
The profits come from the development of algorithm based on training data and by dominating the social infrastructure.
와 비슷한 방식으로
So, in other words, the profits come from the monopolized rent-seeking regime.
우리가 화석 연료를
No, there's a second point. We are still using a lot of fossil fuels.
아주 먼 옛날에 그 화석
Now, fossil fuels,
동물이나 식물은
thousands of years ago, the fossil fuels are not the same as animals or plants that existed thousands of years ago. That's the relationship between data and labor.
디지털 활동, 우리들의 자유로운 디지털 활동에 대해서 직접적으로
So, capital does not directly subsume our free digital activity. However, the records of our activity, which is data, can become
ownership과 비슷한
capital stored in their data centers. That is how the AI businesses can achieve a status like an owner. That is why our activities disappear over time, but the records of it data becomes part of the capital. That is how we can distinguish data from labor.
젤레케 교수님.
Professor Zelleke, please.
Yeah, let me try to address briefly each question. So, Julio, what happens to the state with basic income? Of course, we might want it to wither away, but basic income won't take us all the way to communism, where the state might wither away, right? But if we think about the state currently as the police protection of private property, essentially, we could expect that maybe the that got a laugh. That's interesting to me. But we could think that maybe the priorities of the state will shift more in the direction of increasing redistribution, right? If we start down the road with a basic income, then maybe we continue down that road and we actually protect people more than we protect private property with the state. In terms of the contribution of basic income to ecological sustainability, there I'm a little bit of two minds. I mean, I think it could very well in some of the ways that that we've heard about already, but it could also increase disposable income and leisure time for people, which might lead to more travel, right? As we saw sort of after COVID restrictions ended, the surge of travel around the world, right? So I think that the basic income is one part of that equation, but the other part has to be that we have to tax these negative externalities. We have to tax polluting businesses and polluting activities of our own if we're going to want to reduce those. And then finally, on the effects of basic income, or not of basic income, but of income support programs during the pandemic and the contribution to inflation, I think there's a lot of contributions to inflation from the pandemic, right? They're not necessarily related only to the income stimulus that took place in lots of countries, but let's think about what some of that inflation was about, which is actually higher wages for workers. That's an excellent side effect of that income support that was sent out during the pandemic. We want more of that. I think this concern about inflation is one's always raised in relation to basic income, and I'm not an economist, but we need the economists in the movement to address that question, because I don't think it's really a very important one, but it is one that's very salient, so we do need to address it. But I think the way we address that, if we're supporters of basic income, is to talk about the positive effects. And certainly, the experience in the United States was that many people were able to move out of or avoid certain professions that were, kind of extractive in the ways that we're talking about in relation to AI. that where they were very low paid, where there were no benefits, and they were able to move on to other activities and try out other things. So that's a wonderful effect of basic income. And if it means that for the workers who remained in the labor force, the wages are higher, then that's something that we as an economy have to grapple with. There's certainly enough profit in the United States and in other countries to accommodate that rise in wages without causing inflation.
네, 감사합니다. 저희가 시간이 지금 너무 없기 때문에 정말 중요한 질문
Thank you. We are almost out of time, so we're going to take only one or two really burning questions. Professor Ji-Eun in the middle, please pass the mic.
Hello. I have first my question to Dr. Pinto. I'll make it very quick. I appreciate you mentioning about the 과로사, the long working hour until dying. And according to my study from my team, it was surprising to find out that actually the standard workers who were assumed to be working in a more or less stable job compared to non-standard job, or working long hours, excessive long hours as a group, if we compare this. This kind of indicates that actually income is not the single reason for this long working hours. The reason why I'm saying this is we may be actually too much tamed or used to this capitalistic working labor intensive system. So basic income may not naturally lead to an ecological activity. And in that sense, because we're talking about basic income in reality, we may need a nudging program maybe. And in this sense, I'm sure many of you are aware of the participation income. And I'm at the point, my argument is that we need participatory income as a necessary stepping stone before going to basic income, because to kind of detox ourselves from how we've been so used to this exploitating nature and labor kind of system. So I want to hear your thoughts on this. Second question is to Geum Doctor. I will just continue in English. Just quick question. Because of all the worrisome side effects or destructive results of AI development that you mentioned, actually, Sam Altman and his crew have developed a new concept called World Coin. And already more than 2 million people are in this world, and they issue a world ID. And they actually say everything the basic income network have been saying. You can get the dividend just by being unique you. And this also is opposing to this monopoly of data, because they use this basic coin with a crypto style system, meaning this data is tracked and you have the ownership. This is the decentralized, also autonomous organization concept they also want to introduce. And I have some, I don't know how to look at this at the moment. So I want to hear your thought about this new movements of this Bitcoin basic income. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 1분 내로 답변 각각 부탁드릴게요.
Maybe within 1 minute.
네, 일단 제가
Alright.
디파이 그 코인 샘 엘트만이 그 주장을 하고, 그리고
So Sam Altman is arguing for that DeFi coin. He is a supporter of basic income and creator of OpenAI.
듭니다.
But I am quite pessimistic about his vision.
여러 가지 화폐 개혁안들이 있는데
Now there are many reform ideas.
그런 방식으로
for the currency system today,
를 개혁을 해서 기본소득을 주는 방식을 생각할 수는 있겠지만
leading to basic income, including his idea.
방식으로
However,
기본소득과 연결될 수 있는지
any decentralized scheme cannot lead to basic income, I think. The ideal itself looks similar, but when it comes to feasibility, I am pessimistic.
만들고 기본소득
Now, Sam Altman founded OpenAI, and he is combining the idea of basic income.
자본
With that, I appreciate that in itself, but the OpenAI LLP is a capitalist enterprise,
이 모노폴리 렌트를
and
앞으로
its AI model
자본주의 회사로서
cannot be sustained without rent seeking by paying the developers very low wages.
이 인공지능을 활용한 수익에 대해서
Therefore,
1%다 또는 10%다.
you can talk about 1% or taking 1% or 10% from the AI-generated profits for basic income
훨씬 더
is a much better idea than Sam Altman's.
Thank you for the question and sharing that information. Actually, I'm not surprised with the conclusions of your study group, because that's indeed, and I think there are multiple reasons for that. I don't know if you looked into the reasons, but I think that kind of more stable, or in big companies kind of jobs normally attract a certain profile that is more interested in accumulating profit, so this is a circle that sort of self-fulfills itself, right? A prophecy that self-fulfills itself. And there's as well this, I don't want to be too harsh in the words, but almost vigilance, collective vigilance within those companies, that if you want to leave earlier than what is expected, people will look at you sideways, will probably judge you for only working 10 hours per day, right? So I've worked in an atmosphere like that, so I know the feeling. But this being said, if I would have to choose between implementing a basic income or a legal reduction of working hours, I would go with the second. So I really think that those should go in parallel. But when I talk about disposable time, and sorry if I was not clear on that, I'm always assuming that the state must ensure a legal reduction of working hours. This might not mean a lot in a country like South Korea. If my memory doesn't betray me now, I think 2 or 3 years ago, there was a legal reduction of the working hours here, but it was to something close to 60 hours per week, right? So it's still, a too big amount to be capable of doing something else. On participatory income, I would have a lot to say. So I've written a full paper on that, and basically dismissing it as a preparatory step for basic income. First, I do agree it is a very powerful and a very easy way to present a concept, much easier than basic income. Yeah, we need to finish. Sorry, we can discuss later, but yep, just 2 seconds. Once you look into the details and to the concrete implementation of a participatory income, it becomes much complex, and I'm convinced that in the middle term, it will end up just be as a means tested that is far from the original proposal of a participatory income.
마지막으로 젤레케 교수님 잠깐 말씀드릴게요.
Lastly, Professor Zelleke.
Yeah, just one quick point on working hours. If you look at the OECD data, the best way to reduce working hours is to raise taxes. Korea has low taxes, and the countries that have lower working hours in Europe have much higher taxes on labor. That's the way to do it.
네, 감사합니다. 오늘 여러 가지 이야기를 많이 못 하셨는데요.
Thank you very much. So we have had a lot of discussions. I hope the discussion can continue even after the session. Thank you very much.
안녕하세요. 서포터즈 이소연입니다. 이번 세션이 끝났습니다. 지금 통역기를 중앙 데스크에 반납 부탁드리고 신분증과 함께 교환 부탁드립니다. 3시에 여기서 개별 세션 1이 이어집니다. 다른 세션들은 지하 1층에서 3시에 시작될 예정이니 참고 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다. Hello, I'm Saboteur Soyun Lee. This session is over. Please return the translator to the central desk now and exchange it for an ID card. This session is over. The concurrent session 1 will continue from here at 3 p.m. Other sessions will start at 3 p.m. on B1. Thank you.